Hi, DeLeon here for Hobby Game Dev, and today I want to talk about what we can learn from Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. Now, there's going to be a lot of sources I'm going to use throughout this presentation, a number of which I'll present sort of at the bottom as a URL, but I first want to call particular attention to these sources by Chad and Sean, links you should definitely follow later on, both of whom base their work on these other links you see here. These are really foundational to the work that I'll be showing. Additionally, there's some YouTube video you're seeing near the end. I believe it falls under fair use, purely educational purposes here. Trying to use in the context of demonstrating examples from old games, which happen to be one person's capture, not going to hide their name or anything, but could be another capture or playing, of course, the game itself. It was, to begin with, not their material that they're presenting. But what I want to talk about today in particular are the relationship between movement of non-player characters and player characters, the way that winds up with an emotive or expressive capability of personality, and then I want to show the purpose of randomness. In fact, it's going to lead to a little a rabbit trail of a number of different ways randomness get used in games. And last, we're going to bring it around and show some of the cutscenes, which maybe some people don't remember this, but Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man had cutscenes in them. And we're going to take a look at how those compare and contrast to more modern uses of cutscenes in games. So in other words, let's talk about Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man. We're going to have a few other games sprinkled throughout just for a case of context, but it's really fundamentally about these two games. And we're not talking about, to be clear, Baby Pac-Man, which a lot of people, knowing me and my interest in research for pinball, might assume I'd bring up. I do have to at least acknowledge the fact there's this hybrid, half pinball, half video game thing called Baby Pac-Man. It's not good, don't play it, not worth looking up or studying, but it exists. Now, what does each ghost do? Many people think the ghosts maybe move randomly, or maybe they all move aggressively straight at the player, but they really each have very distinctive personalities. And they are Shadow, Speedy, Bashful, and Pokey. And of course, I want to acknowledge that Pokey, who also goes by Clyde in Mr. Pac-Man, and Ms. Pac-Man goes instead by a new name, Sue. There's an additional female character in Ms. Pac-Man, but otherwise the ghost's fundamental logic for movement functions the same way. Now we can look at this diagram. These are screen caps of the Chad BIRCH project, or actually the Sean illustration from earlier, which I just learned about through the Chad BIRCH project. But if you look here at the different illustrations of each ghost, you can see the fundamentals of their behavior. The red ghost is based on chasing directly at the player. That's the most obvious and aggressive behavior of any of the ghosts. The blue ghost, by comparison, looks at a point triangulated, so it first looks 2 units in front of the Pac-Man, and then it takes the angle towards the red ghost and goes across that distance the other direction. It seems like a very complicated, convoluted way to do this, but fundamentally or functionally what's going on is that the blue ghost is trying to ambush the player from the opposite side that the red ghost is coming in from. And in practice, if the red ghost is close to you, which it often is because it's so aggressive, both of them kind of just seem right on your tail. But these neat situations do happen where they'll wind up closing you into a tunnel because red's coming along one way, blue's coming from you at the other. In the bottom, we see the pink ghost. And now the pink ghost's behavior is it tries to get ahead of where you're at. It looks 4 units in front of Pac-Man and tries to move there. Now, ideally, this concept sounds good because it's trying to get in front of where you're at. But as you can see from this illustration, where you're at may be right behind a wall, in which case you can actually lead this ghost deliberately away from where you are, because the direction in front of you isn't the same as where you're going. And in the bottom right, we see the orange ghost, really the dumbest of the bunch, or the most random. The orange ghost behavior, when it's more than 8 units from the player, it tries to go straight at you, just like the red ghost would. As soon as it gets within 8 units, it flees to the bottom left and runs a little circuit. It just goes to the bottom left of the screen and ignores Pac-Man altogether. So basically, as long as you're not between the orange ghost and the bottom left, you can even scare it away just by getting close to it. Now you might be wondering, why should we care about Pac ghosts? You know, because doesn't this seem very game specific, and shouldn't we instead be thinking about things that can relate to more types of games that are out there? Well, what we're really looking at, because, okay, yeah, it's not the player's movement, it's not the player, it's not the environment, it's also not smooth or even complicated movement. There's no acceleration or deceleration. There's no graceful expressiveness of weight or heft or friction or traction. So why should we discuss it? Well, first of all, movement in games needs a reason. In a lot of games, like Sonic or Mario, there's coins or there's rings to pursue. And those give you something to move towards, but it's also useful to have things to move away from or to move in relation to. So if we look at a game like Midway's Joust, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of other enemy birds to interact with, and if they weren't, the player would have no reason to fly in some of the interesting ways that flapping-based control scheme and momentum-based control scheme allow the player to do. Secondly, motion isn't just the player. As the game developers, we're not only concerned with how the player moves, but how, of course, the AI moves in relation to the player. And it's another thing, it's just animation that has some consideration to the player's location. And I'll show you, especially when we get towards the cutscenes near the end, why it's maybe useful to think about it that way. Now, third, the AI can be thought of as forming a navigable space that the player moves within. If you think of a way more classical, not even a digital version of a game, so say chess, and you could picture the playing field as to where all the different units have their threat. You can picture that as a topology within which the other player has to consider their moves. In the same way on a Q*bert field, knowing how the different characters move or knowing the patterns of their movement affect the pathways within which the player has to navigate. So in the same way that a player has to fit the environment that the character's avatar is interacting in, so for example, Mario can't even finish a Sonic level because he couldn't make it past the loops, it's equally important that the player's movement is a reflection of the computer's AI movement. That's part of what I think we gain from looking closely at Pac-Man Ghost AI. Fourth, movement can be expressive even without having game feel. So Game Feel, it's this book I'm always trying to tout as something I think everybody out there should read. It's by Steve Swink. It focuses on game feel, which is this notion of kind of heft or momentum or bounciness, or how that comes across in acceleration and deceleration and input curves and all this stuff that he defines as being the games that fall in the intersection of polish, real-time control, and spatial simulation. Now, due to, like I said earlier, the way that motion happens in Pac-Man, it's not really a game feel kind of game, but what's cool about it is we can see how even just the nature of decisions that the ghosts make can help us learn personalities and express personalities from the game that we can then learn to associate with each of these different types of ghosts. Now, Pac-Man, this is from the BIRCH, they quoted Toru Iwatani, Pac-Man's designer, saying that this is the heart of the game. I wanted each ghostly enemy to have a specific character and its own particular movements, so they weren't all just chasing after Pac-Man in single file, which would have been tiresome and flat. So once again, it gives each of our ghosts a particular personality, and thankfully a color to match each of them too. Because it's worth thinking about that early on, Taito's president was actually pressuring Toru Iwatani to make all the Pac-Man ghosts red. Apparently, the president of the company was concerned that the pastel palette of friendly colors might lead some players to think that those ghosts are on their side as allies rather than as enemies. And of course, this is the same problem that we see on the old Nintendo Entertainment System version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which has all 4 Ninja Turtles in the same red masks, because it was based on the comic, and the old comic cover had 4 red masks, but it wasn't the same personalities we've come to associate with Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael. In the same way, Inky, Pinky, Blinky, and Clyde need their colors, or we wouldn't know how to behave differently based on which ghost is near us. And of course, I think we're all for the better that Toru won out that argument. So the question of why not have all the ghosts always chase the player? Well, so we can again look sort of at Pac-Man through Chad Birch's excerpt with Toru Iwatani's interviews. To give the same tension, I wanted the monsters to surround Pac-Man at some stage of the game, but I felt it would be too stressful for a human being like Pac-Man to be continually surrounded and hunted down. So I created the monsters' invasions to come in waves. They'd attack, then they'd retreat. As time went by, they would regroup, attack, and disperse again. It seemed more natural than having constant attack. So partly, at least conceptually, it seems more natural. And I'll show you here, so is a picture of the retreat phase. Every, say, 5 to 7 seconds during Pac-Man, especially in earlier missions, the timing changes in later ones, the enemies stop doing their particular behaviors and each retreat out to their particular corners. This helps spread them out in the middle of play, makes it mean you can't rely too heavily on knowledge of their behavior in a given situation, and also has another neat effect we can get to in a moment through another example. But so why not have the ghosts wander the maze randomly if it's valuable to have them not look like they're constantly chasing the player? And the reason for that is, again, there's a conceptual reason we want the ghost to look smart, but additionally there's a game mechanics reason, and that's where I'm going to tie this together with the previous point with one of my old interaction artist examples called Be Different. Now here in Be Different, you'll see we have a smiley face we can control, and a slider I can use to adjust between random and deterministic AI. If I set the ghost AI, or I'm sorry, the B AI to random, my technique for playing is as simple as getting away from the herd. Because as long as I'm away from the crowds, I can even be near them, and they just won't come at me. I can just kind of steer clear of where the packs are. That's not that hard to do. And you might think, okay, well, if I make them all very aggressive, if I have them all come straight at me, that's going to be harder to do. But in fact, I can literally run circles around them. And this is where circle strafing comes from in FPS games. When there's aggressive chase AI, and you run circles around it, just because of the way space sort of structurally works out, on average, the angle of their movement leads them back to the center pile, and it's in fact easier to outsmart them when they're smart than it is when they're dumb, which maybe is obvious now that I point that out. If I put the slider in the middle, though, so that half of them move randomly and half of them move deterministically. And again, we can kind of relate this to Pac-Man Ghost, where they periodically spread back out, and then they go back to using intentioned predictable behavior. This winds up being substantially harder, because some of the bees will try to chase me from sitting still, while the other bees give me obstacles I have to squeeze past, and over time, it greatly increases the chances of them catching me, because again, they sort of wind up having a teamwork element, where some of them are covering the ground, and the others are chasing me from being able to sit still, and I have to constantly be on guard. And so that's part of the benefit of having those ghosts occasionally switch from being aggressive to being semi-random in appearance. Now, Ms. Pac-Man's AI difference is extremely important, and I want to focus on this just for a moment, because some folks don't realize this. But so fundamentally, the behavior of those ghosts in that game is actually the same as the ghosts in Pac-Man. But I want to first show you, so if I open up Pac-Man, and I'm going to start it up, I go down. This is the illustration from Sean, as shown in the earlier sources. I'm just going to move straight down. I walk forward, straight down. You'll see they first go to their corner behavior, then they start following their paths. Blue gets me from above, red was straight overhead, orange was on the right side of the maze. I call attention to the relative positions because if I restart the game, refresh the browser, I'll start the same maneuver. I'll go left and then straight down. Now watch what the ghosts do. They're going to go to the respective corners. They come out. And once again, blue will get me from the top, red's going to be straight overhead, orange is going to be to the right. I can repeat this however many times I want. Pac-Man's ghosts are deterministic. And consequently, a high level of skill in Pac-Man really means memorizing patterns that when played out in certain ways, lead to the ghost always moving in certain ways. Now, Ms. Pac-Man is a little bit different. Okay, I have Ms. Pac-Man, I'm just going to move her straight down, just like we did in Pac-Man. And this time, watch the ghost behavior at first. So for the pink and the red, they're really wandering around, and now about 5 seconds in, you can see something clicks with them, and they start moving in a more deliberative manner. Their pink got me first. And if I refresh the browser, I'm going to do the exact same move at first, just like we did for Pac-Man in terms of the same player movement. And once again, pink and red for about 5 seconds at first before they do anything deliberative. Move around. Pink got me again, but now if you look at the ghost positions, they're in different positions than they were last time. And every time I do this, it won't necessarily play out exactly the same way, because there's a little start of the round in Ms. Pac-Man when the ghosts move at different randomized patterns without using their normal behavior. And that is enough complication to keep this from being as deterministic. The red ghost got me first as Pac-Man. So consequently, if you see a high score in Ms. Pac-Man as opposed to a high score in Pac-Man, it means someone actually knows how to play the game well, respond to the AI, and adapt correctly to the play, as opposed to, again, a high score in Pac-Man just means they memorize the patterns, which is no small feat. It's actually hard to execute at high levels due to the speeds involved, the precision of turning around certain dots, but it's very different from having to learn how the enemies behave in order to challenge yourself to counteract them, to juke them, to mislead them, as you have to in Ms. Pac-Man. If we look at more modern randomness, randomness is used in a lot of video games in a lot of ways, for both the player and for non-player digital movement. So the first example I want to call attention to is partial unpredictability. And this is where it gives skilled players an excuse for losing, or unskilled players a chance at winning. So if you look at Super Smash Bros., for example, and they randomly drop in power-ups, some that are surprisingly powerful, some that can really turn the tide of the battle, it means that if a good player loses, they have an excuse of, well, I just didn't get good power-ups that time. And meanwhile, the player who, frankly, doesn't maybe belong in the match has a chance at knocking someone else out of the arena, scoring some points, scoring some wins, because the power-ups sort of level the playing field. In the same way in fighting games, there are some that are much more favorable to button mashing, some that are a little more deliberative and a little more precise. And the button mashing ones is actually easier to play, say, with your younger sibling who may not be as good at the game as you, or if you're an adult, with your child who may be better at the game than you. But it levels the playing field if button mashing actually gives you a chance because of the randomness and unpredictability and all the factors in play. And so that's one use of unpredictability. It's a way to help compensate and smooth out the win and loss, as opposed to a game which is more deterministic like chess, where a sufficiently skilled player and it could continuously dominate someone who just isn't that good at it. Okay, now for the next version of randomness I want to look at, we're going to look at longer-term unpredictability. So this forces search even on replay. And my favorite example of this is Dr. David Doak from GoldenEye, 007 James Bond. In it, there's a mission where you as James Bond, you're supposed to meet up with a double agent who's hidden in the facility. Levels literally called facility. You start in the air vents, and you got to make your way through the bathroom. Many players will remember this level. Not all of them realize, though, that there's actually 8 different locations that Dr. Doak may randomly be positioned in. What this means is that even if you've practiced this level a lot, as you, for example, have to make the time for earning invincibility in this game, you still can't count on David Doak ever being in the exact same location that you are hoping he is in. And so you still have to search. Even if you're practiced at this level, you have to approach it from the mindset of James Bond of, I don't know where the double agent is, I have to actively look for this person. A more modern example of this, of course, is found in a game like Left 4 Dead, in which there's randomization of where the loot for the weapons caches appears, or where certain types of enemies or bosses appear. And that means that even if you've played it multiple times, just like you should as a survivalist, you can't count on that predictability. You've got to be ready to adapt, and that puts you in a certain state of mind as a player, which is important, like I say, for the comparison or difference between, say, Miss Pac-Man or Pac-Man's play. For shorter-term unpredictability, it can produce fear because there's no systematic solution to a situation. My favorite example of this, Resident Evil 4, newer Resident Evils did it as well. I assume it's in older ones, but this is the first one I noticed it in. The zombies don't all just move at you at a constant rate. They will occasionally, unpredictably, stumble forward a few steps at a time. And what this means is, when you're dealing with a crowd of them, as you often are in this game, you can't just pick off the closest one at a time, knowing that you're making the right decision, because the one that was at the very back of the crowd one moment could be the one that's at the front of the crowd a moment later. And this makes it much harder to manage that crowd because, once again, you can't apply a systematic algorithmic approach to it. You have to deal with the fact that you don't know how this is going to wind up, and that's part of the excitement that comes from this sort of game. On an even tighter form, the weapon, the laser point that you see here for the pistol, shakes and jitters a lot, and that adds, again, a short-term unpredictability, a fear from not being able to compensate with, like, highly honed skills or timing, and that makes this game more fearful, and that's part of the dynamic of a zombie game. An illustration I did of this is another Interaction Artist project, which I'll pull up now. Now here in DARKPLACE, it's meant to be a minimalist view of how zombie games make things scary. I have a limited cone of view. You'll see sometimes they turn red and they rush in faster. Those are angry ones. I've got a double-barrel shotgun that has a longer reload every other frame. But because of the unpredictability of their movements, when I turn around, I can't count on them coming at me in a way that my mind can accurately simulate, because I don't know who and when got angry and stumbled forward at faster rates, and it creates this just much more claustrophobic feeling of you only can trust what's right in front of your eyes. You have to keep turning to constantly reassess your situation, which of course is a much more authentic behavior for someone in a frightened situation, as opposed to a more deterministic scenario where you can be in greater control of the situation that's happening. So that was DARKPLACE. Now another form is immediate unpredictability, as in playing with probabilities. This is often manifested in the case of an old game like Doom with a shotgun that has a exaggerated spread to it, so that it fires, in this case, say 5 to 7 pellets that fan out. And the effect of this is that if you're further away, there's a high probability that you might miss the target altogether. You might hit them with 1 pellet, you might hit them with 2, but you're going to do a fraction of the damage, as opposed to if you're up close, there's a 100% chance that you'll do 100% damage to that character with a weapon. In the case of a game that doesn't have shotguns, weapons like machine guns that have a high level of spread as you hold down the trigger actually has the same effect, just spread out over time. So if you hold down the trigger at a target and say GoldenEye with a machine gun over time, it creates a spread pattern, and the further you are away, the less chance you have of hitting them. And this creates an impulse to want to be close to the opponents, to improve your probabilities, even though, of course, getting yourself closer to them means that they either have an easier time shooting you, in the case of a multiplayer deathmatch game, or in the case of these games like Doom, in many cases, they have melee attacks that makes them much more dangerous if you're up close, as opposed to at a distance, where you have room to anticipate their projectiles, dodge behind columns, or otherwise take cover. And so in this way, short-term, even immediate unpredictability within a single frame or within milliseconds can have an effect on the movement of a player throughout the space in relation to the AI characters. Another use of unpredictability is playing with probabilities in a larger sense. So this, of course, is a shot from Minecraft, in which you're constantly, if you're playing in a survival scenario as opposed to a creative one, mining for resources. This is an unusual sight because this has got diamond blocks on the top, redstone on the left, and iron ore in front of us. But every time you knock out a block, that could be the time when you find the material you were needing. You were really looking for gold. You were really needing iron ore, even just needing coal, and every block you hit could be the one that has what you want. And there's a lot of research in this. There's actually a good name for this. Many people call it a Skinner box. It's operant conditioning, or variable ratio reward. And there's these various contraptions that psychologists use, especially popularized through B.F. Skinner's early work, in which we have a rodent or a pigeon, and if there's a lever it can pull that makes food come out of a dispenser, and it does it consistently, so like say every time it pulls the lever it gets food, when it's hungry it'll pull the lever and get food, however many food pellets it needs. Even if it's a consistent number, but not once, so let's say once every 10 times, it can pull that lever 30 times to get 3 food and it's fine. But if you make that a variable reward, so that any given time there's a chance that that's the time it gets food, but it also has no way to rely on how many more times it has to pull to get the next food to come out, it will basically become addicted to pulling that lever. It will just keep cranking and cranking on it because it doesn't know when its next food will come, and at any given time it could be the food that it needs. And so this builds an addictive behavior into us. And Minecraft does it. More famously, slot machines rely heavily on this type of dynamic, but it's a use of randomness in games. And again, looking back at these older games can give us a context for where some of this randomness maybe first planted its seeds within the industry. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the cutscenes and intermissions in Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. They're really, I think, both charming and in a way illustrative of things that have happened in cutscenes since. Now, many people haven't necessarily even seen the cutscenes because these are hard games to play. But the first cutscene happens after round 2, second after round 5, third one after rounds 9, 13, and 17. I'm going to show you those. These numbers actually are the same for Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. Of course, the cutscenes are different. Now, the first thing I want to be showing us here is the video, Pac Intermissions, as posted by Velvet Rolo. You'll see the red ghost was chasing Pac-Man. Pac-Man then chased the ghost back. In the next one, the red ghost tears its cape, or its cloak, on a nail. You can see its leg. In this third one, I'll be honest, I don't even know what that slug thing is. But the important thing I want to point out about those is that in those videos, it didn't advance the narrative. It didn't really tell us much about the characters. It was serving some other purpose for those games. It's giving you a break. Let's look at Ms. Pac-Man's by comparison. Remember, these came later, after the Pac-Man intermissions. There we go. We've seen Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man are in love. Here we've been given a nugget of information about the character we didn't have before. We didn't necessarily know if Ms. Pac-Man, for all we knew, could be the mother. Could be a sister. But in this case, makes it very clear these two are in love. And once again, that's a cutscene that gives us information about the characters. We saw Ms. Pac-Man chase Pac-Man, and then we saw Pac-Man chase Ms. Pac-Man. They're taking turns. It's not like one character's chasing the other and the other just gets caught. They genuinely seem to both have a thing for each other. That's new information we didn't have as players beforehand. It's not affecting play, but it's information that maybe as players we have an interest in gaining. Let's watch the third intermission. Pretty big moment. I mean, if this was a sitcom and then two characters had a baby, it would be a pretty big deal to us. But once again, I have to be clear that this cutscene happens multiple times in the game, depending on which level you're beating. And also, it's not like Baby Pac-Man or Pac-Man Jr. begins to then show up in the action. It doesn't affect gameplay at all. It goes right back to playing Pac-Man or Ms. Pac-Man just as it did on all the levels before, and continues to for all the levels after. Just for sake of comparison, let's look forward at the Pac-Man Jr. Cutscenes. Pac-Man Jr. is not an especially great game, not especially historically remembered, but it has scrolling, which we'll see will affect the types of stories they can tell. Here at the bottom we see a baby ghost, and on the top we see a baby, or Pac-Man Jr. The children try to play together. Ms. Pac-Man scares away the family of ghosts by eating a power pellet from the yard and calls her baby inside. Kind of a charged moment. Yeah, there you can see the scrolling technology that they had for Junior Pac-Man. here, Junior Pac-Man is offering a balloon to Junior Ghost. And you'll see there the parent behind the bush is still uncomfortable with this interaction. Is not approving. Now if you watch the third intermission, you see the parents are chasing each other and totally angry. The children escape and fall in love. As a student and friend of mine pointed out, this is in some ways Romeo and Juliet. They have made it in spite of their family's disapproval of what it is that they have. And for context as to like what function these are, because these aren't really storytelling in the same way, or at least the story has very little to do with the gameplay, because then you go right back to more Junior Pac-Man. It doesn't suddenly involve your love with this baby ghost. I like to pull up these cutscenes from other old games. So this one is Tetris NES All 8 Endings from English 1 Stud Sanctum. And what you're seeing here is that based on your score, you get a different rocket. Tetris is historically a game of Soviet origin, Alexei Pajitnov, and so this is authentic, I guess, as far as these things go. And each time you see a different rocket, you're seeing a new ending based on the player's score. Now they have a full-fledged space shuttle. Here's where things get weird. So what is going on? Again, clearly it's not telling us a story. It's not anything to do with what the blocks do or don't mean. You're not, say, building a space shuttle in the game. Let's look at Tetris's ending game B for some more clues. This video is posted by CleverUsername42. And what we see here, based on the player's performance, are a number of classic Nintendo characters. We see Pit, Donkey Kong, Bowser, Mario Luigi, Samus, or Link, and Princess Peach. And the minarets took off like rockets, which once again, it's like a playful thing, it's a fun thing, it's a celebratory moment. It's not a narrative piece. And so if we want to figure out a better sense of what function these are serving, we can look back a little bit further to arcade Tetris. This is a short video as taken by Little Dr. Chris 25. And this is the Atari Tetris from the arcades, which was originally a multiplayer, which is why I see the two layouts. It's a single player playthrough though. And at the end of a round, it was built into levels. We get this little dancing Russian man. Again, it's got nothing to do with the action of the game, but it's a celebratory thing. It's a prize. It's a reward for us for making progress that we've made. And if we want to look back even further, we can look at a game called Central Park. There we go. Okay, so now this is Central Park. It's an old Gottlieb pinball machine. And if you watch the back glass carefully, there's a little two-dimensional monkey and a bell. You see the points. Currently at 42 and 72. 82. Now as soon as this next round happens, it's going to score over 100. Watch the monkey on the back glass. Bang! Hits the bell. We get this little animatronic reward for the player's success. It's a little bit like our Dancing Russian, as a 50s game, Pinball Knockout. You'll see on the playfield there's an area inaccessible to the ball. There it is. And when the player achieves certain scoring goals, you get to see a little animatronic animation of one fighter knocking out the other one, and the ref throwing a count. It's a cutscene. In pinball, in this case, from the 50s. And this is a video from Doug Barger on YouTube. Now, of course, if we look at even slightly later video games, we start to see more cinematic significance. So, we look at the opening of Ninja Gaiden from Nintendo Entertainment System. we learn that we just saw our father die. Like, this is clearly a significant moment. We've got the music playing, we've got full pictures drawn, we've got animation happening, we have text for like representing speech in a way we didn't for Ms. Pac-Man or for Tetris or otherwise. And this is setting up the action in a way that relates to the game we're going to play. It gives us a reason to play. And just like in the notion of Mario Brothers, you're there to save the princess, or in Zelda, or you're there to save Zelda, they're setting up the scene here just like they would for a film before you play the game, in a way that didn't happen for Tetris or for Pac-Man in the same way. And of course, if we look at later games with cutscenes...
Are you picking this up?
It's Command & Conquer.
I know you need more
by
background,
TV.
We're up against it. Non forces have fortified this beachhead at X16Y42. Intelligence is still coming in, so we can't tell you a lot.
Now this is actual, like, live actors with prepared speech, with decent lighting and audio, and this is clearly a higher production value, but it's mission relevant. He's telling you instruction for the mission. So this is, again, kind of a little more like that Ninja Gaiden mission in that it's not the game graphics, it's a whole other approach to it.
We found a chink in their armor.
Though if I skip ahead, are just symbolic action. They don't actually relate to exactly what just happened. They don't actually relate to the mission you're about to go on. They're just showing you something awesome. They're showing you planes, or in this case, so this hawk, this eagle, is a symbol for GDI, the good guys who are fighting the terrorists, represented by the scorpion, and they show the hawk carry off the scorpion, which again is a little like what we saw from the cutscenes of Ms. Pac-Man, where it's just this neat thing to say. It's to giving a break. It's a prize. It's a reward for the progress you've made in playing this game. And so here during the early 90s, mid-90s, we were seeing a mixture of these two uses of cutscenes. Now, part of what I think is especially interesting for looking at the cutscenes of a game like Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man in contrast to these sort of 90s and 80s era cutscenes, or mid-late 80s were for the NES games, are that if you look at a game like Assassin's Creed, or even a more modern game than that, we'll see a lot of in-game cutscenes, or IGCs, that use the in-game graphics. Now, they may play animations that you don't see in-game when the player's in control. They may use camera movements that you can't do with your second analog stick. But they are, by using the in-game models and in-game settings, in a way a little bit more like the Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man cutscenes, in that they're using the assets already built for the game to add to the story, or to reward the player for making the progress with new information. And that's all I've got to cover for today. I want to thank you for watching. Hopefully it's been informative for you. You can find more resources at hobbygamedev.com. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.